During the Great War, the proposed mechanical solutions to the stalemate included big wheel landships, wheeled bridge pushers, trench-straddling personnel carriers, self-propelled artillery, and machine gun carriers. The preferred acquisition was named tank, but even tanks remained contested between different weight classes, armaments, types of mobility, and protection levels. The doctrine too remained contested. Indeed, many of the same questions are asked today. Should tanks surprise the enemy or be preceded by bombardment? Should tanks assault by day or night? Should they be concentrated or distributed? Should they be combined with all arms, some arms, or no other arm? Should they lead or follow other arms? Should they sustain a penetration or hit and run? Should they hold objectives or rally to the rear? Should they aim at enemy fortifications, or infantry, or artillery, or supplies, or headquarters? The term tank is often used loosely for any armoured or fighting vehicle, but is best operationalised as a tracked armoured fighting vehicle, or AFV, whose armaments are designed to fire anywhere on its circumference. Not all AFVs are tanks. Some are optimized for carrying personnel or supplies, for instance, even though they might also be tracked and turreted. During the Great War, British authorities categorized all variants as tanks, although later they sensibly differentiated tanks from carriers. Doctrine is any set of official guidelines. By 1916, tanks were in use, but the doctrine for their use remained unsettled. British doctrine was subject to users in France, users at home, politicians, staff in the War Office, staff in the Admiralty, which used AFVs of its own, higher echelon commanders, the commander-in-chief of the combatant command in France, that is, the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, and the staff at the BEF's General Headquarters, GHQ. That year, tank operations were small and distributed, and mostly frustrating, but sometimes spectacular. By 1917, the value of tanks was proven. In 1918, they necessarily contributed to the defeat of Germany, without need for the decisive offensive planned for spring 1919. This book reviews the doctrines and battles involving British tanks during the Great War. The book rediscovers 7 principles of mechanized warfare: terrain, concentration, surprise, combined arms, speed, sustainment, and exploitation. These principles are not obvious. No formal principles of mechanized warfare or even maneuver warfare were articulated at the time. The British Army's 8 principles of war, objective, offensive, security, mass or concentration, economy of force, movement, surprise, cooperation, as articulated by the War Office's Field Service Regulations, as reeditioned in 1909 and reissued in 1913, were not formally applied to mechanized or maneuver warfare until the 1920s, although some appear in the Tank Arms Doctrine in 1918. See chapters 10 onwards. Furthermore, some principles were subordinated or conflated with others. The principle of mobility is most conflated. Mobility is the ability to move. It is routinely conflated with maneuver, but they are not the same, although they are related. Maneuver is movement with intent to reach an advantageous position or to prevent the enemy's movement into an advantageous position. Both mobility and maneuver are conflated with their means. Pedestrians, equines, and bovines are the traditional self-moving means of war. Mechanization is the substitution of machines for biolocomotion. Vehicles are means for moving things. Some vehicles are capable of moving themselves, so are known as automobiles. Armor is a protective material. Although armor is often used as a shorthand for armored vehicles or even mechanized forces, maneuver does not need to be achieved with either vehicles or armor. Mobility is still achieved mostly in unarmored vehicles. Maneuvering on foot continues to be trained despite mechanization. In English, carried troops are conventionally known as mounted, and moving on foot is known as dismounted. The principle of appropriate terrain implies mobility. The principle of mobility is dependent on the selection of appropriate terrain. Over time, the requirement for easier terrain was rebutted by the requirement for more mobile machines. The elevation of a principle of mobility to the same level as the principle of appropriate terrain was tempting, but never formally articulated in any doctrine written by or for the tank arm until the 1920s. The 7 principles of mechanized warfare. Terrain is the scope, topography, and morphology of an area of land. The principle of terrain expects forces to be used where the terrain is conducive. Artillery prefer to fire from behind cover. Cavalry prefer open terrain where they can exploit their speed. Infantry prefer woods and buildings, which cover them from enemy observation and fire. Even before tanks deployed to France, Doctrinists realized that tanks should attack where the terrain is dry, open, and undamaged, or has been improved by engineers. None of these qualities was true of the first operations involving tanks. Doctrinists continued to specify appropriate terrain and to require more mobile vehicles until the principle was routinely fulfilled in 1918. The concentration of forces is the quantity of forces per area. The principle of concentration expects friendly forces to concentrate against the enemy, ideally where the enemy is weakest, in order to achieve a local superiority. The principle of concentration is often attached to a caveat about the advantages of distribution wherever one is trying to avoid enemy forces or to move quicker on multiple routes than one could move on one route. Offensively, the principle of concentration was already one of the 8 principles of war before tanks were ever mooted. Nevertheless, when tanks were first deployed, their concentration was much weaker than their prior doctrinists had wished. Users continued to specify their wish until it was routinely fulfilled in 1918. Surprise is an affect in reaction to something unexpected. The principle of surprise expects friendly forces to surprise enemy forces so that the enemy forces are less capable than otherwise they would be. The enemy forces might be unready in that particular space and time. They might be caught in transit before they can optimize for combat. They might be facing away from the attackers. They might be cognitively incapacitated by the psychological shock of the unexpected. Surprise is conventionally subcategorized in space and time, such that a force might be surprised in only space or only time, or both. Before tanks were introduced, higher echelons routinely gave up surprise in hope that days of preliminary bombardment would disable enemy defenses. The tank doctrinists usually preferred surprise over preliminary bombardment. They got their way by late 1917. To combine arms means that at least 2 arms cooperate. During the Great War, Anglophones did not talk of combined arms, rather of cooperation. The Tank Corps' final wartime note on tank infantry doctrine defines cooperation as the act of working together to one end, namely to clinch with the enemy and destroy him. End quote. The principle of combined arms expects the advantages of one arm to compensate for the disadvantages of another, or the advantages of both arms to synergize. For instance, artillery bombard enemy artillery indirectly, without direct line of sight, until other arms can directly neutralize enemy artillery, after which friendly artillery can safely move forward. Artillery usually cooperated indirectly, rarely in direct sight of other arms. Tank doctrinists expected infantry and tanks to cooperate directly, although disputes remained about which arm should lead, how close they should be, and how they should behave towards different targets. However, the first use of tanks was rushed, such that at least some infantry had no experience with tanks, and some tank crews struggled to identify friend or foe. Over time, doctrinists perfected the combination of tanks, infantry, indirect fire artillery, machine guns, direct fire artillery, aircraft, Royal Engineers acting as combat engineers, and tanks adapted for engineering. Speed is the rate of movement. As typically used, the term implies quickness relative to normal. The principle of speed expects you to act quicker than enemies react. The principle is applied to command, i.e., make decisions quicker than the enemy, although decision-making faces a trade-off between speed and accuracy or correctness. Control, i.e., make subordinates execute your intent quicker. Communications, i.e., get information about the enemy quicker and communicate your intent to the executors quicker. And movement over terrain, i.e., reach objectives quicker. Clearly, the principle of speed overlaps the principles of terrain and mobility. Speed has never been an official British principle of war, although many doctrinists have emphasized speed of advance, from Sun Tzu to the first tank doctrinists. As Chapter 1 shows, urgency is explicit in Ernest Swinton's Doctrine of February 1916, lest enemy artillery hits assaulters on their objectives, or counterattackers get organized before assaulters consolidate. The deployed tank is agreed. However, the first operations were slowed by a creeping barrage to a speed less than half the maximum speed of the first tanks, a fact ignored by commanders of the time and historians later who complained about the slow speed of tanks. In August 1917, the Tank Corps Chief of Staff, JFC Fuller, developed a raiding strategy that expects an advance into the enemy's rear and a return to friendly lines within hours before the enemy can intercept. By 1918, JFC Fuller was pondering medium tanks that could strike enemy headquarters before the enemy could counter the offensive. Still, he did not separate a principle of speed, although he listed it under the principle of mobility, which is a principle of war. In the 1920s, Basil Liddell Hart conflated the two, a conflation that usefully draws attention to speed, but neglects other aspects of mobility, such as agility and obstacle crossing, other capabilities, especially lethality, and other principles, especially sustainment. Sustainment is the enablement of forces to keep operating. Before tanks were deployed, the British Army already struggled to replenish the assaulters with their consumables, such as ammunition and water, and with materials such as barbed wire and tools to fortify captured objectives against counterattackers. A solution is to reserve infantry with loads of consumables and defensive equipment ready to fortify the objectives after the assaulters have captured them. Another solution is to send a fresh wave of assaulters to each objective line. When tanks were introduced, no resources were provided for sustaining them during operations. Instead, they were supposed to rally to the rear within hours. Even there, service and support were inadequate. Conventionally, the arms are differentiated from their services and supports, such as mechanics, armourers, medics, and veterinarians. At the time of the Great War, the British Army tended to refer to service and support as trades. Poor sustainment, terrain, and mechanical reliability contributed to a perception that tanks are useless beyond hundreds of yards of assault, a perception that some historians continue to perpetuate. However, the tank arms acquisition of supply tanks, mechanical reserves, and fighting reserves helped to establish a reputation by 1918 for tanks to penetrate miles into enemy territory, even though mechanically their reliability had not improved much. Exploitation is the pursuit of enemies in retreat and/or the interdiction of enemy command, control, communications, or logistics. JFC Fuller wrote, "Exploitation is pursuit, the annihilation of a broken enemy by every available means." End quote. However, he also wanted exploiters to target enemy command, control, communications, logistics, and particularly artillery. The principle of exploitation expects provision of some type of force that is optimized for pursuing and interdicting. In the Great War, the arm optimized for these things was the cavalry, mainly on promise of speed. However, speed is only part of mobility, and horses are less mobile than pedestrians in certain terrain. At first, tanks were expected to break through the defensive lines before cavalry exploit into the rear. But in their first operations, tanks failed to break through, and the cavalry was not any quicker on the battlefield anyway. Over time, the tank arm planned on achieving more exploitation for itself and required medium tanks as specialized tanks for exploitation. The tank doctrinists usually allowed for cooperation with cavalry, but mostly out of deference to GHQ. As soon as 1917, they were prospecting attacks by light or medium tanks on artillery, logistics, command, control, and communications, simultaneous with the main assault. By 1918, Fuller prospected such attacks before the main assault, on promise that defenders at the front would be incapacitated by confusion and scarcity. Months after tanks were first used, a headquarters was established for the new arm. This HQ gathered meritorious staff, including Hugh Ellis, Gifford Martell, Stephen Foote, F.H.E. Townsend, and eventually J.F.C. Fuller. By 1917, Fuller was writing doctrine that was authoritative for subordinate users, but still subject to higher echelons and still restrained by inadequate resourcing. Within months, he suggested combined arms tank raids to fill the gaps between offensives. Months later, in November 1917, elements from his proposals for raids and offensives came together in a satisfying offensive at Cambrai, on good terrain, where and when the enemy did not expect, with concentrated combined arms at unprecedented speed, with unprecedented sustainment of the assaulters, and some capacity to exploit. In 1918, Fuller developed a technically ambitious proposal for a decisive offensive in 1919, best known as Plan 1919. As Chapter 13 explains, it is often touted as the inspiration for Germany's Blitzkrieg in 1939. Yet Plan 1919 contains a dilemma between combined arms offensives and independent tank raids. Indeed, Plan 1919 vaguely expects future medium tanks without other arms to surprise the enemy's headquarters before a general assault by combined arms. Fuller himself never resolved this dilemma. By 1923, he erred towards independent raids on enemy socioeconomics by submarine-launched amphibious tanks. He soon refocused on sustained offensives by combined arms, although he remained overconfident that smaller or mechanized armies, supported by their own aircraft, could occupy the enemy's capital within days. He ignored the dilemma in later years, which helps to explain why historians have missed it. Historians have missed, too, the fact that the conventionally identified Plan 1919, dated to May 1918, was actually Fuller's second Plan 1919, and that both are developments from a Plan 1918 that he wrote in 1917, as this book reveals for the first time. The first chapter of this book compares the doctrines for mechanized warfare proposed from 1914, even before tanks were first used, in 1916. The second chapter discovers how tanks were used in their first battles in September 1916, at Flers, Courcelette, and Thiepval. Chapter 3 moves on to the battles of Ancre in November. The next chapter traces the development of doctrine by the headquarters of what would become the Tank Corps, from late 1916 to 1917. Chapters 5 to 7 review the role of tanks in the first great battles of 1917, Arras, Messines Ridge, Passchendaele. Chapter 5 includes the first French-British conference on tank doctrine. Chapters 5 to 7 include the first experience of Canadian and Australian formations with tanks. Chapter 8 reveals Fuller's creative proposals for envelopment and raiding by tanks during the summer of 1917. Chapter 9 explains how a proposal for a tank raid became a satisfying combined arms offensive at Cambrai in November, and how it was undermined by underprovision for sustainment and exploitation. Chapter 10 describes Fuller's proposal of January 1918 for a decisive offensive in spring 1919, effectively the first Plan 1919, although he never dated Plan 1919 back to January. Chapter 11 reviews Fuller's simultaneous proposals for combined arms raids in 1918, pending the resourcing for a decisive offensive. Chapter 12 introduces a little-known alternative Plan 1919 by Stephen Foote, then working on the tank staff in the War Office after serving in France with the Tank Corps. Chapter 13 transitions to Fuller's subsequent Plan 1919, which Fuller dated to May 1918, although without admitting any influence from foot. Chapters 14 to 24 explain the great combined arms offensives of 1918, Hamel, Survillers, Amiens, Bapaume, and Albert, Arras, Épinay, the Canal du Nord, the Saint-Quentin Canal, River Sella, Mormau Forest, and River Sambre. Chapter 25 reviews the doctrinal and operational findings from the Great War, synthesizes the quantitative data from the chapters, compares the conventional wisdom in the historiography, and establishes the tank's real contributions to victory in 1918 and the lessons for the principles of mechanized warfare today.